Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
I'm recording this special podcast during Holy Week of 2016, and if you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that I am a big believer in story. I believe that story is the medium of our time. It's how truth is communicated, how the world is perceived. It's not new, obviously, as an art form or as a means of communicating truth, but it certainly has been heightened in our time. And so I am also a huge believer, those of you who listen to the podcast regularly will know, in families sharing the stories that explain holidays. I always retell the Thanksgiving story every year. I try to retell the Christmas story every year in a podcast. I urge families to share those stories. Many of us remember when we were growing up that, it was the stories we were told by significant adults, explaining the world, explaining the 4th of July, explaining maybe even our birthday, that have stuck with us and shaped us. So, having written a book called Killing Jesus, about the crucifixion of Jesus and about the events leading up to it, I wanted to take just a few minutes in this podcast and tell the story of the scourging and the crucifixion of Jesus in very human, historical, graphic terms. I'm not going to go into the theology of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. I'm an Orthodox Christian, by which I mean only that I'm a traditional biblical, hopefully theologically sound Christian. And so you pretty much know what I believe about the supernatural aspects of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But I think it's important for us to tell our children what they probably will not be able to tell you in church in graphic terms, and that is what happened physically, what happened at the human and natural level. So in the next few minutes, briefly, I'm going to tell an overview of that story, because I believe that it ought to be repeated and repeated often. And if it's a little bit graphic for you, just keep in mind that we honor the holiday and we honor Jesus by being willing to look the horror fully in the face. Now, Jesus Christ was hunted his entire life. We know that from reading the Gospels. Even before he was born, there were conspiracies against him. Once he was born, of course, there was an attempt to kill him that resulted in the death of many other young boys his age in Bethlehem. We read not only in the Roman sources, but also in the Gospels that Jesus was the subject of much concern amongst the religious leaders of the day. There are many occasions in the Gospels where we're told, and they took counsel together to see how they might kill him. They counseled together to see how they might put him to death, etc. Jesus even mentions this in several of his sermons. You're going to kill me. And of course, some of the crowd who don't know about the conspiracies against him say, you're crazy. What do you mean? We're not trying to kill you. But of course, he was speaking to the conspiracies at higher levels than most of the crowd knew. So we know, and I think even those of you who listen to my podcast, and welcome to you, by the way, who are not Christians or not of any religion, will know that Jesus entered Jerusalem to observe Passover at the end of his life, the last week of his life, and did so on what Christians call Palm Sunday. And then during that week, he appeared in Jerusalem, he taught, he cleared the temple again because of racist attitudes against Gentiles and the use of the court of the Gentiles in the temple to sell goods and wares and animals for sacrifice and so on. That just sent him into a fury twice during his life on earth, and he cleared the temple. So all of that's going on, much teaching, much time with his disciples. And finally, we get down to Thursday of Holy Week. Now, more traditional Christians will call this Maundy Thursday. It's from the old Latin mandatum, which means commandment. So if you see Maundy Thursday, it's the Thursday of Holy Week that Christians commemorate. And on this day, Jesus had the Passover meal with his disciples. Now, Christians who may not be aware of their Jewish roots will call this the Last Supper of Jesus, the communion, for example, but it really was a Passover meal, a Seder, that had traditionally been kept for centuries, obviously. And that evening, Jesus and his disciples went out to the Mount of Olives, and in the Garden of Gethsemane, which was an olive grove, which would have had a fence around it, would have had a locked gate. Jesus obviously was known to the owner and had rights there. Jesus urged his disciples to pray and prayed himself. As we all know, he was then arrested and taken to be tried overnight by members of the Sanhedrin, not the entire gathered Sanhedrin, but just certain members of the Jewish ruling religious council. Well, this was illegal. This was a violation of Jewish law. So to be tried overnight and to not be tried with the entire Sanhedrin present, all of this was a violation of Jewish law. Jesus was hit many times. He was beaten. He was mocked. He was tried. He met with the high priest. He met with the high priest's father-in-law, who was a former high priest, and finally he was convicted. The problem was that the Jews didn't have any law that allowed them to put a man to death. Obviously, the Old Testament law, the Levitical law, prescribed the death penalties, but under the laws of the Romans, agreements with the Romans, the Jews didn't have any right to put him to death. So they took him to Pilate. And of course, this is a very famous exchange, and we don't need to go into the details of it here. Ultimately, Pilate is forced by a chanting crowd, pretty much, to put Jesus to death. Now, during the process of Jesus being interviewed by Pilate, and Pilate trying to appease the crowd, the chanting crowd in the courtyard, without having to put Jesus to death, Jesus is scourged. Now, we've all seen movies of, let's say, British sail ships in the day of sail and in the day of the Great British Navy, 1800s, and we've seen whippings. Well, the scourging of Jesus is not a whipping. It was not the same kind of thing as is done with a bullwhip from our old Western stories, and the kind of lacerations that were done on a British ship as punishment. Mutiny on the Bounty would be an example of this kind of thing. Instead, it was done the Romans called it the almost death. And it was done with a flagellum. A flagellum was either an iron ring or a thick piece of wood which was shaped into a handle. And from it, either the iron ring or the piece of wood, would come woven strands of leather. And into those strands, into those long braids, would be woven pieces of rock, pieces of metal, pieces of bone. Because the idea of a scourging was not to lacerate the skin, it was to tear flesh away. The Romans called this the almost death, and there was a man, an official in the Roman army who was actually trained to do this. Jesus would have been bent over slightly, maybe tied to a pole, maybe tied to a low column, perhaps. But however it was done exactly, the point would have been to stretch the muscles of his back, his buttocks, and his legs. And the flagellum would have been used in such a way. Picture now these lashes coming down around his back, and then the point was that the excessive length of the flagellum would then wrap around to his sternum and to his front. So picture that he's stretched out, perhaps his arms are up, or perhaps they're a little bit more forward, but his back, his buttocks, his legs are stretched, so to speak, and now here come these long strands of this flagellum with these hard bone pieces, metal pieces, rock pieces in them. And as the flagellum hits Jesus' body, these pieces dig into his flesh, and then the official trained in this art of the scourge would rip the leather pieces away. It tore flesh away. And I should say, too, that we're often told that Jesus was whipped 39 times, 40 minus 1, as the Jewish law stated. But remember that Jesus wasn't whipped by the Jews. He was whipped by the Romans. So the standard practice was to take a man to the edge of consciousness, then revive him, and then go again until you got him to the edge of consciousness. So we don't really know how many times Jesus was whipped. And by the way, there essentially were 3 or 4 or 5 whips as part of the flagellum, so to speak, since we're not talking about the one kind of bullwhip kind of whip. And so every time there was a lash, there essentially were 4 or 5, whips basically wrapping around his body. So it's impossible to get too specific about the count. What it definitely did was turn him into a bloody mess. It ripped flesh away. It tore him. Some of the Old Testament prophetic language where it says, "My bones are exposed," etc. This may quite literally have been true. We know of other scourging victims, and they lived the rest of their lives with some of their organs exposed and bones exposed, etc. They didn't live long. They didn't live many, many years, but they did live well after a scourging. So the idea here in Pilate's mind was to show Jesus to the crowd and just a horrible, terrible, bloody mess, literally flesh ripped away. And hopefully the crowd, he thought, might soften it and say, okay, we're done. He's been hurt enough. But they didn't. They chanted for more. Put him to death. Kill him. Let his blood be upon us. And so we should pause here at this moment because this is very important to Christians. The scourging of Jesus, of course, is redemptive. It's meant to purchase our healing, physically speaking, and in other ways as well. And it was a horrible torment. He had already been beaten. He'd already had crowns pressed, big thorns pressed down into his skull as part of a mocking crown. And now he was scourged, and it would have taken him to the very edge of life, and he would have been an absolute bloody mess. I won't get more specific than that, but you can just picture a taut backside from ankles to shoulders, and this thing ripping flesh away. So literally, muscle, sinew, skin, fat. Not that Jesus would have had much given his life, but perhaps even lacerations on the face that tore it. We should acknowledge these things and know them well. Well, then, of course, he's eventually taken through the city. This is the condition he would have been marched through Jerusalem. We call it traditionally the Via Dolorosa, but we don't know exactly what the path through Jerusalem was. But he was marched through Jerusalem. The city began to awaken to what was going on. Women wept for him, and he was taken out to Golgotha, the place of the skull. This was the name both because it was a hill that looked like a skull and because there were skulls there from earlier executions. And now Jesus was crucified. Now, I'll leave off the theological issue of what his crucifixion meant, but I would like for you to know the biology of it. The Romans had tried many different methods to kill people they considered threats to the state. And the one they finally arrived at had come down through the Phoenicians, from the Phoenicians and through many other cultures, was crucifixion. Crucifixion was not about just nailing a man to a cross and letting him sit there until he died. When that happened, and it did sometimes, when that happened, people lived for weeks. As long as you had a little bit of water, you could live for weeks, and your family often snuck water out to you at night and so on. The idea of crucifixion was actually a form of torture people don't recognize. If you would, as you listen to this, if you can, or maybe later if you're driving, don't do it now, stand on the floor and dip your knees about halfway down. Don't be in a full squat, but just go down a little bit so that you've got your knees at about a 90-degree angle, or less than, maybe a little bit more open than that, and put your arms up. So you're making a wide touchdown signal. Your arms are up and spread. And just dip your knees somewhat. Let's say put your buttocks down about 6 to 8 inches from its normal position. Now, this is the position of somebody on the cross. And what I want you to realize is that if your feet were able to be one over the other, and they can't and have you stand, but if you had your feet one over the other and a nail driven through them, and you had a nail driven through each of your palms, this would be the horrible position in which Jesus was on the cross. Now, here's what victims often discovered if they didn't know it already. Crucifixion, like I say, was not just about nailing the man to the cross. It was about what happened once they were nailed. Because when Jesus was nailed to the cross, he suddenly found out that his thoracic muscles, those that were left, began to paralyze, and he could breathe air out, but he couldn't breathe air in if he was hanging from the nails in his hands. So what did he have to do? And all victims of crucifixion, they had to push down on the hole in their feet made by the spike that went through both feet. And that's the only way they could breathe. So push yourself up. If you're standing like I've asked you to, push yourself up to where your legs are straight, and now you can breathe. But again, picture the agony of pushing down on a nail. And so you can only stay up, so to speak, so long, and then you go back down into the dip position, which for the person who's on the cross means they're hanging from the nails again. So you're either pushing down on the nail in your feet, or you're hanging from the nails in your hands. If you're hanging from the nails in your hands, you can't breathe. You can exhale, but you can't inhale because the thoracic muscles, the muscles of the chest and that control the lungs, are paralyzed. So the entire affair of being crucified, which for Jesus lasted 6 hours, is a matter of going up to breathe and then coming back down when you're exhausted. The Romans found this entertaining. They wanted this to be so agonizing that it was fun. Crowds would gather. They would laugh at the criminals being crucified. And it was agonizing for, of course, the people who were associated with the victim and the person being crucified themselves. So Jesus was in total agony. He was fighting for breath. And the 7 statements that he makes from the cross, he makes while pushing down on the nails. They're not just said, British voice, kind of full and effortlessly. No, he's just barely able to breathe and say, "Into thy hands I commit my spirit," or "Mother, behold your sons," etc., talking to John and Mary. The 7 statements that he makes, he's making just barely able to hang on, just barely able to hold himself up, because, again, he has been absolutely devastated physically by the scourging. So this is the condition in which Jesus hangs on the cross for 6 hours, up and down, pain, agony, unable to breathe, sucking in air, saying the statements he needs to say, and then in an exhausted fashion, going back down until he's got to get a breath, and he rises up again. This is the horror of Roman crucifixion. Now, we Christians believe that Jesus hung on the cross from 9 in the morning until noon, and at noon, the sin of the world was placed upon him. The world went dark, and then he hung on the cross until 3 o'clock. And at 3 o'clock, he gave up his spirit, as the scriptures say, and he was, as a human, dead. And he was then taken and put in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, and another man. And then he stayed in that tomb the rest of Friday, all of Saturday, what we would now call Saturday. And then, of course, we Christians believe that on the first day of the week, Sunday morning, what would now be Sunday morning, he rose from the dead. So those of you who are not religious, you've gotten a good history lesson here of what happened at the crucifixion. This is historically true, regardless of what you believe about Jesus. And of course, you would know that as a Christian, I urge you to believe what I believe, which is that this was the crucifixion of the Son of God, who is also a man. For those of you who are Christians, you're going to hear sermons this weekend in your church. You're going to be reading devotionals. You're going to be, who knows, maybe watching good movies that depict this well. And so the theology of it, the spirituality of it, what you believe happened invisibly, spiritually, that pertains to your life, that will all be established by other people. But I always want to make sure that people know the natural, the human story. It's not because I don't believe the supernatural. I definitely do. It's because I think that we should not rush to the supernatural and ignore the fact that Jesus, who we Christians believe was both God and man, was crucified and suffered these horrible things. He had huge portions of his body ripped away. He was beaten horribly. His skull was pierced by thorns. He was marched through a city being mocked and barely able to even walk, much less carry the crossbeam that he was required to carry. And then he was nailed to a cross where for 6 hours he fought for breath and took on the sin of the world, we Christians believe, for 3 hours. So this is the story. These are the historical facts. This is what Jesus in a human body endured. And whatever your form of celebration this Sunday at church, whatever your form of contemplation of this, I urge you to keep in mind that though Scripture is often very brief about these things, it will say simply he was scourged or they crucified him, etc., and it moves on because it's not trying to give us a almost medical report. This is what we now know about Roman crucifixion. This is what we now know about what Jesus endured. And this is, for those of us who are Christians and honor him as God, this is what he endured for us. and looking full into the face of the horrors of it just deepens our faith, deepens our gratitude, and causes us to realize what's been purchased for us. And again, I have many Jews, many Muslims, many non-believers who listen to my podcast, and you are all welcome. But of course, you know who I am, and so I'm speaking about the highest holiday of the Christian calendar, and urging Christians to understand it at a deeper and more natural level. So happy Easter to you. Happy Resurrection Day to you Christians. Enjoy, celebrate, and know what Jesus endured. Even for those of you who are not believers and don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, I will say that, of course, I want you to believe what I believe and live as I do in faith in Jesus. But this is still interesting and important information because it shows us what a man living for God endured in the Roman Empire, and why it was such a profound event. And you may not believe what we Christians believe, but still, this was the profound event that literally divided all of human history to this point. Again, happy Easter, and thanks for listening. And remember now, tell the story. Tell the story. Not just your faith, although that's vital, but tell the story. Tell the practical story. Tell what's hinted at in Scripture, but not fleshed out, a little bit as I have done. And repeat it in your family. Repeat it to your children when they are of a proper age to be able to deal with it, and share it widely, because this brings depth and rooting to this powerful story of all the ages.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator on Fox and CNN. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and The Miracle of the Kurds. His new book is Ask the Question: Why We Must Demand Religious Clarity from Our Presidential Candidates, available on Amazon. Learn more about Stephen at stephenmansfield.tv. The Stephen Mansfield podcast is directed by Isaac Darnold, who also wrote, produced, and performed the podcast theme song. This is a Chartwell Literary Group production.